And hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning from wherever you are watching from all over the world. My name is RJ Ledesma, and welcome to my podcast, the RJ Ledesma Podcast. In the podcast, I interview the country's pioneering business personalities and entrepreneurs to learn more about how they think about doing business, what are their success secrets in business, and can we hack those success secrets? How they've also innovated their businesses during this pandemic, but more importantly, what opportunities do they see emerging in the new normal and in the next normal? Now, is there a business personality or entrepreneur that you would like me to interview here on the podcast? I would love to do so. Please let me know. Drop me a message. We are also live right now on Kumu, CBRC TV, Global Pinas TV, and the Bounce Back Network. If you've been enjoying our previous podcast so far and you are learning a lot from it, please do me a favor, subscribe to the podcast and invite more friends to listen to the RJ Ledesma Podcast. You can also find us on YouTube. Clark, if you can put our YouTube link for the RJ Ledesma Podcast here on FB Live, I would really appreciate it. And tonight, we've got another guest all the way from Singapore, and he is part of Brankas. We've got our good friend, Mr. Mike Dickinson. Now, founded in 2016, the goal of Brankas was to democratize access to financial and identity data. Their clients include traditional financial institutions, banks, and fintech startups. They are a fintech startup company that bridges the access to financial services for everyone in Southeast Asia. So that's a pretty big market, and it's a lot of big motherhood statements. I really look forward to our guest here tonight, Mr. Mike Dickinson, to break this down for us so we can better understand exactly the services being offered by Brankas. So please welcome all the way from Singapore, Mr. Mike Dickinson. Mike, welcome to the program.
Hi, RJ. Happy to be here. Very excited for today's podcast.
Very excited as well. Thanks so much for joining us. Mike, before everything else, I'm just very, very curious. Over here in Manila, we've had our spike of the Omicron variant, and cases now are dropping to, at least here in Metro Manila, less than 1,000 cases per day. But we're still very cautious. We still wear our masks. We're still at our level 2 over here, which means that it's not fully mobile to get around here in the city. How's it like in Singapore? Is it easy now to travel over there? Can foreign visitors come in and out easier right now in Singapore?
Yeah, so cases right now are actually growing. They're fluctuating quite a lot, actually. Nobody really knows the real number. And I think Singapore now is starting to treat it like more and more like an endemic. We are still quite cautious. We're still wearing masks. We're still doing all those sorts of things. There are certain restrictions still in place, but you get the feeling that we're opening up. Yes, we do have flights from different parts of Southeast Asia, different parts of the world still happening. And I think, yeah, some of the blockers around that are getting removed more and more.
Well, I hope to see you here in Manila very soon. We're easing travel restrictions for foreign travelers. So hopefully, as you build the Brankas business here in the Philippines, we get to see you here very soon. And having said that, I'm very curious. Brankas, what exactly does Brankas mean?
Great question. So Brankas means bank safe in Indonesian, in Bahasa Indonesia. And it's where we originally started from was from Jakarta, Indonesia.
I see.
Hence the name. So I think the CTO came up with the name originally.
Very interesting. And I understand I was going through your background in LinkedIn. You were actually grew up partly in Jakarta. Is that right?
Correct. Yes. So I grew up there. I lived there for 17 years, and I did my school and whatnot over there. I'm part Indonesian, so I'm actually from a place called Manado, which is very close to the Philippines. So I grew up there and then moved to Australia, moved around, ended up in Singapore.
Oh, fantastic. So let's greet any of your Indonesian fans listening to you here right now. Maybe your folks as well in Indonesian, in Bahasa.
Yeah, right. Yes.
No, feel free to speak to them in Bahasa. Let's all greet them.
Ya, selamat malam semuanya. Saya aslinya dari Indonesia. Saya sudah tinggal di Singapura untuk 6 tahun ya. Nanti saya mungkin pindah ke Indonesia. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih. Thank you so much. And with that, Mike, let's get into it now. As I have to admit, when you read Brankas, it's and what you guys are doing here in Southeast Asia, it's pretty difficult for, I guess, the layman to appreciate exactly what Brankas does as a financial service. So recently, I heard that you guys just closed a $20 million deal for Brankas for your Series B, which is a big deal, and we'll discuss that in just a bit. But I think the bigger thing here right now is, let's try to explain right now what Brankas actually does, and what is it like when you have to do an elevator pitch and you have to explain to people exactly what Brankas is to an investor. Can you please give us an example of how you'd explain Brankas to an investor in the company?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a fintech company. We play in what we call open banking and open finance. Really, what our entire goal here is to open up and democratize financial services, right? And what we're trying to do is enable for individuals to be able to perform, for example, bank transfers in, not directly within their own banking applications or having to go to the branch. They can do it within other sort of third-party applications, right? And so, for example, you want to do a top-up to an e-wallet, like Gcash, for example. You can do it directly in the wallet. You don't have to go anywhere else to do it. You stay inside that e-wallet and make that experience completely seamless, right? Really, what we do this on is based on the very premise of open banking, which is the data, what happens with finance, it all belongs to you. Right? It belongs to you as an individual. It doesn't belong to anybody else. It doesn't belong to any corporation, any bank, and even us as a third party. It only belongs to you, and you decide what you get to do with your funds, with your data, and the financial products that you have access to. Right? And that's the very premise. So, when you're going through and doing these sorts of things, explicit consent is super important. It's really important to be able to move funds around, to share bank data, bank statement data, for example, and very important for you to be able to set up, for example, a bank account, all digitally, right? And ultimately, I guess what we're trying to do is ensure that we allow for an open ecosystem so that really it creates equality for everyone in the market.
I guess what people might have a difficulty or a challenge understanding, especially if you're not from the finance or tech sector, is the idea of the word open banking. What exactly do you mean when you say, I hope you don't mind, but we have to just get these terms, I think, very, very clear. What do you mean by open banking and open finance?
Right, great question. So open banking itself is really about, so banks traditionally are fairly closed. They provide um, uh, uh, they provide mobile applications, for example. They provide branches, so you can perform financial services. Really, what this means is that you are able to perform in relation to a financial institution actions for that on other applications, right?
Mhm.
So that you can create more seamless experiences. For example, like as the example I gave before, an e-wallet, or for example, if you're looking to receive a loan from an organization, you can share your bank data directly inside the loan application process, right? And what that allows for is really the more financial access to everyone, right? Again, coming back to my original point, which is, of course, it's the consent of the user, which is super important here. They have to give this. However, after the fact, you're able to go off and do many things with your finances in any application. And really what that means is that no longer is it the traditional way of having to go to the branch or having to go onto a mobile application owned by a bank. You can do it anywhere. And really that's what we think is going to be, it's democratizing that sort of financial inclusion, right?
Yeah, I like that different use democratizing because obviously the other one is well, I think not that it's the exact opposite, but in a more dictatorship or authoritarian model versus a democratized model for banking. If you don't mind, so people get to see a better picture of it, let's present with them what it is if there is no, I say sort of like Brankas, and what it is when Brankas is there. What is it when it's the closed model, and how difficult it is, and when you democratize it, and what happens all of a sudden when the system is democratized with what Brankas is doing. If you don't mind going through that one, because that helps us better understand what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a really great use case around this is how you go off and create a bank account, right?
Mhm.
In the most traditional sense, you walk into a branch, you have to go travel there. It may take you 10 minutes, may take you an hour, depending on where you're located, 3 hours in some parts of Indonesia and the Philippines.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
and so like it takes, you have to go there, you have to provide documentation. It's a very manual process. You have to sign with a wet signature. And there's various sort of KYC processes that you have to do at the branch. And before you know it, your entire day is gone. And then you're waiting for the bank account to get created, which can take anywhere between
Oh
one
yeah.
week to 3 weeks, 4 weeks, right? And it's a very cumbersome process. With Brankas, with open banking, you're able to go into an application of your choice. And if our offering is there, you're able to create a bank account directly inside that application without having to go to a branch, without having to go and travel for 3 hours to try and get to one. And you're able to then provide your documentation. You can do KYC directly, know your customer, and take a selfie and everything like that directly in the app. And the account is created. And I think that's one of the most, I think obvious use cases, which helps not only, people become banked and be able to get access to more financial services quicker, but also actually helps the banks, right? It allows them to sort of diversify the channels which they can provide. They can provide their sort of banking products to.
No, no, now I think it's much clearer to many people exactly how it democratizes and why open banking is clearly a boon, especially for well, I'm sure the situation might be similar to Indonesia, where there's a large percentage of the population that remains unbanked. And just for the reasons you said alone, I mean, number one, it's just the logistics to get to the bank if you live in the rural area to get from the rural area to the bank it takes quite some time. Then plus the documentation which you aren't sure that you need to bring along. I mean, these are things which people don't take into consideration. Having said all that, one, Mike, I understand how the concept works, especially in our tech startup world. But offline we were talking about. I have sometimes to explain these concepts to my dad, my mom. And they're in their 70s. These things are just quite alien to them. How would I explain Brankas now to people who might not understand this? How do we laymanize it? I guess for them.
Right. So I think the best way to laymanize something like this is that if you can, you go into an application of your choice and you want to just set up a credit card quickly. You want to set up a bank account. You want to apply for a loan. You want to, do a funds transfer, like move money from bank A to bank B, and all within any application. You can do that today. And Brankas sort of sits behind and powers the infrastructure for that. So a kind of a metaphor for it is, if we think of the banking institutions, the e-wallets, the finance companies, they're all the houses. We're the roads which connect them, right? And so that you can actually get from point A to point B in a much more simple manner. So we care a lot about the very roads which cars are driving on, and the houses and the buildings and the infrastructure that it's connected to.
Sort of like you're the back office. People don't see Brankas in action.
They don't see Brankas in action. We drive all the connections, so that ultimately you get the experiences which make your life easier.
Really, and really great story about Brankas. It was starting off the year, or entering the year with a 20 million Series B funding, coming from your friends Insignia Ventures Partners. That's a really great story, and it has something directly to do with you coming and growing the business here in the Philippines, if I understand correctly. Tell me a bit more about why the Series B is so significant to Brankas.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, thanks for that. I guess it's sort of validation first and foremost of what we're trying to do, right? I mean, we wouldn't receive funding for something like that if it wasn't working. So what we're really looking to do with this additional funding is really start to grow the connections that we have with different banks. We're looking to obviously have more organizations, more fintech companies, more wallets use the products that we have, and use the connections that we have, so that for example, they can avail the account opening in their applications of choice. But we're also looking at expansion. So today we are mainly in Indonesia, the Philippines, in Thailand, and in Singapore. And we've got various small projects in other countries, but we really want to use the funding we've recently received to, again, bring sort of more democratization in other markets. And expansion is something that we're going to be pushing for. On top of that, we're also looking at building new products. Of course, that's something. We're a product-heavy company, very heavy on the sort of engineering and product side of things. About 85% of the company is sitting at that within those two teams. And a lot of what we're trying to do is continuing innovating and building new stuff which people can use, and hopefully again make their lives better.
And that's exactly what you are. You are the chief product officer of the company, and that sounds interesting. What exactly does a chief product officer do for do for Brankas and for the company?
Everything. It feels like these days. More serious note. So we build tech products, right? And so what we do in the product organization, along with our engineering team, is identify problems which exist in the market. And we try and understand sort of, we've got end users which are complaining about not being able to get access to, say, for example, bank accounts. We've got fintech companies saying, hey, I can't connect to the banks. It's very difficult. How do I do that? Right. And so we construct products around infrastructure to sort of solve these problems. Right. Sounds easy, but, as they say in product management, ideas are cheap. And there's a lot of cash that goes into the actual validation, the research, the design, the implementation, and eventually the outputs, and then even then you're still going, please work. So exactly. And that's a very sort of a process. And then of course we have to remember we have to continue to sort of reiterate and make the product better and bring just a better experience for people, generally speaking. So it's always an ongoing process in product. So yeah, that's what we do.
And I'm sure you're learning a lot about how to iterate and develop the product coming into the Philippines. I'm sure I've had the same experience working or speaking with other startups which have expanded, let's say, from Indonesia to the Philippines, that they really have to sort of like, although generally the demographics and the lifestyle or the economy is similar, they've had to customize the products coming into the country to fit what's happening there, not force fit what they currently have, but rather say, here's the product, we got to come in, but we've got to sort of make it just custom built for that country. I guess that's what's happening to you guys as well. I mean, something worked in Indonesia, but bring it to the Philippines, it had to be, I guess, tweaked to match the current demographics, the lifestyle of the Filipino consumer.
Yeah,
Is that correct, Mike?
absolutely.
Is that correct to say?
Yeah, right. Yeah, so localization is a real thing. Yes, we can try and say that, financial infrastructure between the two countries are quite similar, but actually, and this is sort of, our discovery as a company is that they are actually very, very, very different, right? And something that we sort of have to make sure that we're, we have to localize the products in relation to the different countries. So when we release something in Indonesia, even though functionally it solves the same problem, but the way that it's being built is almost entirely different to what is being released in the Philippines, and that's something that we absolutely have to sort of take into consideration. I'll give you an example. So in Indonesia.
Please. Yeah.
Yeah, so in Indonesia, we've got recently well, not recently anymore. Pandemic makes me feel like it's recent. 2 years ago, we had the QR code, QRIS in Indonesia, so that you can pay between any sort of bank account, wallet, and whatnot in the sort of Indonesia context. And it's a rail which is starting to be used more and more, and it makes it easier for people to sort of transfer funds between this. Now, during the time that we were sort of building on top of this rail in Indonesia, in the Philippines, I think now it's a bit different because QRPH is becoming made available over there, so you can transfer funds between accounts using a QR code. But right. What we found was that the switcher which was built for Indonesia is a completely different switcher to. Sorry, when I say switcher, I mean like a different infrastructure which allows for people to move funds from point A to point B using a QR code. In the Philippines, it's actually riding the InstaPay structure, which I'm sure people in the Philippines are familiar with, to move between bank accounts. And so what that means from our perspective is that we have to completely change our mindset when we're actually building to these two different rails, right? And so that maybe gives you an example of like just one sort of payment method, one example. Another example is eKYC. For example, if you're signing up for a bank account because of in the Philippines, the BSP has made it very much easier for you to set up a bank account faster and online. And they've been very relaxed and, well, I wouldn't say relaxed, but more open to being able to set up bank accounts, especially digitally, waiving wet signatures and things like that. In Indonesia, that hasn't happened, not as aggressively, right? And so what we're finding in the Philippines is that world of digital, the ability to set up bank accounts digitally without having to provide signatures and things like that is actually moving really fast. And that's unbelievable. And so compared to the Indonesia, where there's a lot of regulatory red tape that you have to jump through, and in order to get there. It's fascinating the sort of differences in how the two markets operate.
Very interesting. Now, having said that, obviously that the Philippines was a market that you really looked at and find something that's worth moving into, I guess, just from the sheer population. I mean, of course, Indonesia 3 times the population of the Philippines, but obviously the Philippines is a great market for you guys to be in. And I want to pick your brains why you chose to expand over here, I guess, after Indonesia. But more than that, give me an idea right now of who are your current set of clients here in the Philippines, and what type of products have you engaged them with here in the country?
Yeah, great question. So the majority of our clients in the Philippines are fintech companies, and they range from digital banks to lenders to wallets, and really sort of the use cases that we supply for there are in relation to for example being able to do a top up to an e-wallet. I think our one of our products is currently live with Como, East West Bank, today so that you can do a top up into Como for high savings purposes. Similarly for Tonic as well. And we've got, but there's other use cases. So for example, for lenders, they use our products for collection purposes, right? And they want to be able to do the collections process inside their application so that the user doesn't have to deviate away from, to another banking app or anything like that. They have a seamless process, which makes the experience far more, there's a perception of safety and a perception of comfort when you're able to do everything within one application, right? And so what those are usually the use cases we provide for. We do provide for also e-commerce companies. So of course, when people are making purchases for goods online, they use our sort of payment rails there. And then there's also sort of credit scoring companies as well, which are using sort of bank data in order to improve credit scores so that people have more fair and accurate access to loans.
I'm just very interested because as you guys come in, you say that you're working with other fintech companies. So that means that these are digital banks that are coming out and other services that relate to helping top up the wallets, right? Because you're sort of like the back office to everybody else. You provide the roads for them to connect, right? Just a question. I'm just wondering because when you come into a country like the Philippines, many of the banks, I guess when they work together, they want a silo. I mean, because they want feeling, if I allow this one, it might take away services from me, right? I mean, that might be the feeling of some people because if I open up too much, I might lose a lot by prescribing all these services. Why not make it proprietary to me, or they can only use my services? I'll just build everything in house because I don't want to share. Is this something that you also encounter, and how do you address problems like that? I that's what I'm guessing, at least.
Yeah, absolutely, and we do absolutely come across those problems. And the way that we address them is that we work with banks very closely to enter sort of agreements and through rev share and whatnot, so that it's mutually beneficial. And banks, for example, will get a bit of a slice of the pie. But we also want to make sure that we want to keep it fair as well. The other side is that we work with the BSP on many initiatives actually, just to ensure that there is a push towards the democratization, because ultimately what we're trying to bring to the population is the ability to get access to cheaper financial services, cheaper funds transfer mechanisms, and ultimately just a fairer economy, right? And that's something that we, underlying to everything, we passionately believe in. These are sort of the ways that we work with that.
Yeah, I like that, and I'll stop there just a bit because I think there's something that came to my mind. Things become cheaper, especially in terms of financial services, when you have when you're using something like Brankas. Help us understand, I guess, right now, so people understand, how do things become cheaper when Brankas is in the background helping open banking services?
Right, that's an absolutely great question. So if I had my way, I would love for people to be able to, digitally move funds for free, right? And if we went out for dinner, and then you paid for it, and I wanted to pay half to you, and I wanted to pay you in cash, nobody's charging me for that. And I want to, I'm giving you that cash, and there is no transaction cost that occurs when I'm passing you the money cash in hand, right? Mm-hmm. Well, ultimately, from a digital perspective, we would love to see something. Something close to that. Hopefully, ultimately, we will get to that place, right? Now, how do we do that? Well, we do that. There's a more traditional sort of payments model, which what we refer to as the payment gateway model, whereby funds are moved from a bank account into an account owned by a third party, a payment gateway. The more famous ones around the world are companies like Stripe, PayPal. And many others, the funds are then distributed to the target organization, right? So the funds jump to go into a destination account. What we do is we don't actually hold funds at any point in time, right? When we initiate a payment from a bank, it moves directly to the other bank. and there's nothing in between, right? And
So there's no
and,
there's no
and
float. There's no float over there.
there's no float. There's no float. The whole point here is that it's a payment initiation, and the funds are going to the location that it's supposed to, right? And hence why we're able to keep costs so low. And hopefully we can make it free at some point in the future.
Excellent. And then it was also mentioned that Brankas can help with banking more of the unbanked. For me, how I understand it, looking at how the infrastructure is going on here in the Philippines, is, for example, how we're getting more people banked right now is something as simple as GCash, which for me is very disruptive because now more people can turn their GCash from their e-wallet into a bank, and all of a sudden you can start generating credit information. You can do eKYC over there. How does Brankas also work in that sort of ecosystem right now to help to bring more people who are unbanked to becoming banked?
Right. So as I was mentioning earlier on, so what we do is we provide the rails for account opening for example, multiple banks to have access beyond just GCash, right? In multiple applications. Imagine that you are you're sort of working with another e-wallet provider over there, and you wanted to go and set up a bank account on that e-wallet. Well, you would have a gamut of options to go through and say, I want to set up a Union Bank account, I want to set up a BPI account, and a Metro Bank account directly within one application. Again, no longer having to go to a branch. I just have to download the app and follow the steps of eKYC on the bank of choice that I want to get access to, right? And so, again, it comes back down to that, like not having to travel the 3 hours to the bank branch to do that. Now, I think companies like GCash are, awesome. Like, I mean, they've gone off and they've tried to, sort of approach it from the perspective of an e-wallet. In Indonesia, there are four main e-wallets. We've got OVO, GoPay, Linkaja, and Dana. There's a bunch of others, but those are the main ones. And they're vying for, for a very similar sort of territory, right? But really, the way that I see it is that that's just a stopgap for what is ultimately people trying to do. They're trying to set up a bank account online. They're trying to deposit funds into it, and they're trying to do things with it, right? And that's the gap that I see as being the opportunity.
Exactly. And having said that, let's move a bit forward here right now. And many of the people listening to the podcast always get a better appreciation of how did the founders, I guess, of a company come across this problem, and how did they choose to solve it? Because many of them coming here are saying, did he come from a corporate background? Did he come from a non-corporate background? How did he stumble across this problem and want to address it? I know that you weren't there at the founding, but you spent many hours with Todd Schweitzer, who I understand is the founder of Brankas. How did Todd come about this pain point or this irritation? Because it seems to be something that lies a lot here in Asia. He worked many years in Asia, I guess, to discover this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe Todd's now been in the Philippines for 8 years now. I think that's part of how he sort of stumbled on the problem, is probably when he was going out and wanting to do, basic financial services. He was probably comparing it to perhaps his own, his home country, the United States, where things are a little bit easier over there. They're not perfect, but they are easier. And so being able to understand how to bring some of this capability to Southeast Asia, that's the idea. However, as we all know, this part of the world for each of the countries are already very different, let alone compared to Southeast Asia to other parts of the planet, right? And really, when you get stuck into trying to understand the problem statement, and you start to realize that, hey, it's not just as simple as okay, how do you digitally open up a bank account? It's much more fundamental than that, right? And so there was a discovery, I think, where, initially banks weren't, they didn't even have the rails to be able to provide these sorts of things. You mentioned before they were very closed. Well, closed is what's happening in Southeast Asia. Right. And so what the initial business model really was about was, nobody has access to this infrastructure, this open infrastructure. Why don't we build it? right? And so that's what the initial stages were, with sort of working with banks to open up their core infrastructures so that other companies could plug into them. So other companies could get access to payments, could get access to data like bank statement, bank identity data. They could get access to other financial services such as originating loans, account opening, and so on and so forth, right? And that's where initially sort of Brankas was, right? And so there were lots of sort of projects that were happening at the time. However, that's also not scalable, right? Because ultimately you get to a place where you're going, well, I'm building a massive project for this massive bank, which requires a huge amount of resources, and it's bespoke for that bank because it usually is. And so what we decided was just like, well, now we're getting access to all these connections. Let's aggregate, the connections and offer these in a simple format to the customers on the other side. And so hence was born the products which serve up the fintech companies, the e-commerce companies, and whatnot, right? And so really what the round of funding that we've received is actually to grow that, because the connections, we've already worked really hard on that side, and it's taken a long time. And to be honest with you, we're still doing that today. But now we're able to start, we've been cooking in the kitchen. We're starting to now dish out the dishes, right? And this is what we're able to start doing now.
Very interesting. So the current business model of Brankas was not the initial business model that Brankas had come up with in the start, because it was I guess you were working with one big bank and making a bespoke model for them, and it didn't seem to be something that could be sustainable or scalable in the longer term. Is that right?
Yeah, because effectively, what you would look at is a sort of a linear trajectory in terms of growth, right? Onboarding a bank, it doesn't just take months, RJ. It takes years, and
yes,
it's
exactly.
and even just getting the first bank over the line in order to do these sorts of things was a lot of effort. And to this day, even after all this experience, it's still a lot of effort. I'd say it's a little bit easier now because there's more openness to the concept, but there's it's a long sales cycle, it's a long requirement cycle, and for a time you're going, where's the money, right? And so now you amplify that by say 5 banks, and before you know it, you're scrambling for resources. You're trying to make sure you're implementing with the limited resources that you have, and
Yes,
ultimately it's a very difficult thing to scale on. And so what we created on the other side is a software as a service through our integrations, so that customers can just sign up, start testing, and away they go, right? And that's the pivot.
When you guys began, it was out of I'm just trying to piece together the timeline. You said Todd lived in the Philippines for about 7 to 8 years, and this is where he discovered the problem. But if I understand correctly, it's called Brankas because it did begin in Indonesia. So he said it was something that was a problem in the Philippines. It looks like you have the same problem in Indonesia. I'll start with Indonesia because it's a bigger population. How did you end up going to Indonesia to start off Brankas?
Yeah, I mean that's partly to do with our CTO Kensho, who's based in Jakarta, and there was he was the first there. So what really how it transpired is that they started to try to serve the or addressing the problems in terms of financial access out of Indonesia, but the reality is that Todd was going back and forth, and realized, of course, that they are similar, not the same, gaps in the Philippines, and so very quickly expanded into the Philippines to address infrastructure problems with banks over there as well.
All right, I get that. When did you come into the picture, Mike? I'm just very curious. Were you there when they had to make that pivot towards moving more towards software as a service for Brankas, or were you there at the point where they still were with the old model?
So that's a great question, RJ. So I joined almost exactly 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago now, right before the pandemic, and I was brought in to effectively productize whatever technology existed with Brankas at the time. And so you could ask the founders that, I'm partly to blame for the pivot. But really, when we started to go down that sort of software as a service route, that was basically the initiatives which I was pushing into the organization. And because when I joined, not really a product team at the time, I think we had one product manager, but he was doing many different things that were not product at the same time. And there was nothing really which was being defined in terms of actual product development. So those are some of the things that we needed to put in place, and then identify the problems that we were trying to solve so we can make ourselves a lot more scalable, right? And so that's what we've been hard at work at actually during the pandemic.
Yeah. And having said that, I'm going to look back at the pandemic, the timing of the pandemic. So there were new products that you had to productize, right? So that means that right at the point where they said, okay, we're going to switch over from the old model to our SaaS model, our software as a service model, we got to productize it so we can market it outside. Pandemic hits. How does the pandemic now affect Brankas? Was it actually a boon or a bane to Brankas? Did more people accept Brankas as a result of this pandemic and its products? And corollarily to that, did you also have to, I guess, also modify or tweak the products that you were creating as a result of this pandemic?
That's again a great question. I'll tell you the initial reaction, which was we were terrified.
And that's a common reaction here on the show as well for the others who had to pivot during the
right.
pandemic.
Exactly. I mean, crystal balls aside, there's just no way that we were thinking, oh wow, like what are we going to have to do during this time? Are things going to like sort of capitulate effectively? And we were already sort of thinking about like, do we have to lay off staff? Do we have to do many different things to make sure that the business stays alive for longer? However, we stayed strong, right? And so what we over the next few months, what we realized was that if anything, the pandemic pushed for the democratization of financial services, because no longer could people go to the branches, no longer could people go and pay cash in hand to another person, no longer could they go to a 7-Eleven to top up to a e-wallet or to an Indomaret to do the same thing. They needed to do it online. So it turned out to be a boom. And it turned out to be something which actually was heavily beneficial to our organization, because the problems of that we were trying to address just got amplified because of the pandemic, not being able to get around. Everything had to go online, and it's bizarre how these sorts of things happen, but it really just helped sort of hammer home the point that finance needs to be much more digitally accessible.
So it really just accelerated the use of the Brankas product, I guess.
Right. And I'll give you, so we launched a product during the pandemic. Actually, it was targeted at the Philippines, because what we noticed was that, obviously we were lucky, but many people were not. And so they were trying to build businesses like sort of off the side. Maybe they'll make they'll do some cooking or baking at home, and they'll put up a Facebook page. And what we realized very quickly was, wow, this is an opportunity for us. And that actually gave birth to the product that we now call Pay today. So Brankas Pay is the product. And so this Pay product allowed for micro merchants to go and collect payments via bank transfer without having to receive cash in hand. They didn't have to share their bank credentials. They didn't have to send a screenshot to validate the payments being made. Right, it was all very seamless. You commit the funds transfer, and then on the merchant side it says the money is being moved. And so we saw that as an initiative to actually help the people in the Philippines to make to allow for them to move money around better.
Did any of the products have to be modified a bit? I mean, as a result of the pandemic? I know that, the basic product was there, but like you said, you learned this new product for the Philippines, Brankas Pay, was a result of understanding the technology works. We just have to use it for this particular product. But were there any other changes that you had to make as a result or modification of the current financial products that you had?
we had to add more banks. That's one thing, because more and more people wanted access. Yes, I would say that because more and more people were starting to utilize sort of the systems that we had very quickly. In fact, we had to start making a lot of iterations on, making the experience more seamless, more comfortable. A lot of front end sort of impacts, which we had to implement during the pandemic. Um, the but the other such things that we had to do was allow for more data access, because more lenders were looking to push out loans. And yeah, I mean there were a few iterations that we had to do with products. But to be completely honest with you, RJ, a lot of those iterations that we did were kind of in line with what we had to do anyway. It just the pandemic just accelerated it.
I see. And having said that, when you look at the Philippines, what exactly have been so people get a better idea, what have been the financial products that you've produced that work very well here in the Philippines that have solved pain points that we don't get to see, the pain points that we don't get to see obviously from our perspective, but that you get to see from your perspective?
Yeah, great question. So apart from us working with banks on, bespoke infrastructure, which we do quite a lot of that in the Philippines today, what we find is that the hottest product right now is the ability to do the funds transfer, as we call it, the account to account bank transfer within a third party application without having to ever leave that flow, right? And the reason for that is because it allows the tie for that experience directly into, for example, your Tonic bank account. You can top up your funds into there. You don't have to ever leave the Tonic app, and it's a seamless flow for you to do a top up into the account, which makes it just very, very easy for Filipinos who are using Tonic. And of course, what that means is that Tonic is happy because, well, user experience wise, it makes it much more seamless. So I would say that is definitely the product which is just taken off, the digitization and democratization of bank transfers. But we've also got like use cases around the sharing of bank statement data, so that if you wanted to apply for a loan, then you can go in and register for that loan. But then you want to share your bank data. Before, you had to send, for example, a PDF, or maybe you would even have to go to the lending company directly, and you would have to provide physical documents.
Yes,
we completely remove all of that. So the organization which is providing the loan just receives the data straight. And it cuts out literal hours out of the day for the individual who's requesting or requiring for that loan.
Wow. Looking forward and seeing the potential of the Philippines, what are the other products you think that you guys will be creating to leverage opportunities that are here? I mean, there's still a large number of unbanked. There's still a lot of banks. I mean, you're working with a lot of the unibanks, but how about the rural banks? How about the other banks that are not so digitally savvy? What are you guys looking into us in 5 to 6 years to do here in the Philippines?
So I wish I had a crystal ball, RJ, because problems are always moving all the time, and it always feels like a something you're trying to hit. But I would say that if I was to look at, for example, payments, we're looking at concepts in more e-wallet transactions to be able to aggregate those sorts of things. We're looking at cryptocurrencies as a potential option as well. Obviously, we want to do it the right way, so we've been talking to many organizations and the regulatory bodies to ensure that happens. We're looking on the data front. We're looking at much more insightful models so that organization can make much better decisions around lending. So, for example, to be able to say an individual's income is X amount, if they give consent to share it, we can tell the organization this person is earning an income over this period of time. The data itself, we don't see, right? So the data gets passed over to the merchant. We just build the models to help the merchant do these sorts of things. And then really on the other side is around that account creation, being able to grow that. I would really love for us to get to sort of loan origination and being able to offer different loan options through Brankas's rails onto other platforms, so that you don't have to go off and connect to these different organizations. You can apply for any loan on any application, any e-wallet, pretty much anywhere, right? And so that's again, many years down the track. Finally, the other thing that we are looking at building towards is building what is effectively a core banking application, which would help the rural banks, which is really what where we ultimately want to get to, is to be able to provide like the fundamental infrastructure for a fraction of the cost of what it actually takes to do, right? Because we've already built a lot of the original infrastructure. We're able to offer something like this for an exceedingly good rate. And so that's where we see ourselves sort of helping rural banks, not just the Philippines actually, but we would hope in the next few years across the rest of Southeast Asia and hopefully beyond.
Well, hopefully your own crystal ball isn't too far from the truth as well, Mike. And having said that, in the Philippines, like I said, there are a lot of entrepreneurs listening over here and saying, wow, there's a lot happening right now in terms of our digital banking ecosystem, things that they don't see happening around. Where do you think entrepreneurs and startup players and other fintech companies which are emerging, where can they still play in that field where they can support the sort of things that Brankas is developing in our digital banking infrastructure?
So how can other? So let me get this question right, RJ. So you're saying how can other entrepreneurs?
Yeah, are there opportunities to grow also where you're growing? Can they support that growth of what you're doing?
Oh, right.
Or are there places where they can play in that you grow and they grow at the same time?
Yeah, no, 100%. So the whole premise of what we're building for are, so we offer these different sort of connections with the bank, right? But we don't often design the use cases. We don't go off and design the user experiences per se within applications, right? So, for example, in Indonesia right now, we've got a lot of personal finance management applications where you can manage your funds inside an app using the products that we provide, right? And what I would expect, I think in Philippines is already starting to happen, is that people are starting to construct entirely new use cases on the rails that we provide. And I think that is where we will it's not so much the success financially for us, but where we see the success of our products is that we start to see new use cases, new concepts that people create based on the infrastructure that we've created. And I think that's come to us if you want to brainstorm and talk about different potential opportunities. And I'd love to hear like new ideas. I'm sure there's so many use cases out there that we haven't even thought of before as well.
That's great.
It's more about the creativity.
When you say that, let's just flash on the screen how they can get in touch with Brankas. Clark, if you can show that on the screen right now, it's www.brankas.com. If you got some ideas of how you can work with Brankas, they'd be open to it. Again, Mike, just what kind of ideas are you looking for? What kind of partners or suppliers are you looking for to be part of your Brankas ecosystem over here?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're looking to partner with banks, obviously. So if anybody is from a bank on the call, more than happy to chat about sort of what we provide there. But we're also looking to partner with fintech companies. If you've got a new budding idea, a seed stage startup looking to break into a new market, we're happy to talk about sort of the use cases and our experiences that we've gone through ourselves. Again, we're not here to compete with the e-wallets, the PFMs, the lenders, and all these organizations. All we're trying to do is supply to these organizations. So if you've got an idea that you want to sort of validate, or you might have something just getting up and running, come speak to us. And more than happy to sit down and have a chinwag.
And also, lastly, as we start to close off this conversation, we talked earlier on. I mean, before joining Brankas, you also had your fair share of different experiences from other companies of growing and building companies, both which have been very entrepreneurial by their nature. Having said all that, we're talking to business owners and entrepreneurs here right now. If you're to give them three, I guess, life lessons from all your everything you've gained from building organizations, building businesses, and keeping them resilient, what would those lessons be to those entrepreneurs
Yeah.
listening to us here right now?
Right. Okay. So number one is make sure that you have a really clear vision of what you're trying to do, and a metric that you can tie to it, which is not revenue related. A metric which defines the success of the problem that you're trying to solve for. Number two is your customers, have empathy for them. It's so important to put yourself in their shoes and understand their problems and understand the things that you're trying to build. Don't build what they want, build what they need, right? And then number three is blockers within your business, especially internal ones, will be the death of your business if you don't remove them. So your biases should always be towards remove every single blocker that comes into your path as quickly as you can. If you're able to do those three, I think you'll be okay.
Well, thanks again so much. Really great insight. I've learned so much from this conversation, and I hope that the people listening to the conversation and to our podcast have gained so much. Good luck to the growth of Brankas here in the Philippines and in the rest of Southeast Asia. So again, thanks again for your time, Mike. We really appreciate you joining us over here, and hopefully we get to see the growth really of financial services here in the Philippines for the unbanked and the underserved. Again, thank you so much, Mike Dickinson, for joining us from Brankas. Again, this has been the RJ Ledesma Podcast. We will see you next Tuesday for the next podcast. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.